Yeah, so it's a welcome back. For some of us, it's a welcome back to Eve, who's been here before. Last time, Eve spoke about an earlier book that you'd written, Capitalism's Toxic Assumptions. Okay, so Eve is the currently interim CEO of the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland. And in 2022 was similarly for the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Before that, she was the third Church Estates Commissioner for 3.5 years, one of the most senior lay people in the Church of England, despite living just around the corner, really. She was she was the first female chairman of the Board of Governors from 2015 to 2021, and was awarded an OBE last year for services to education and to gender equality. So it's a great, it's a great privilege. I know you're part of the family in a sense, but it still doesn't take away the sense of, we are so grateful and if not honoured to have you with us. And we are, yes, grateful and honoured. Not if not, yes, we are honoured to have you with us to talk about, artificial intelligence, robot souls, the new book. Over to you, Eve, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Right, so this is the book. There's a useful glossary. Enough said. So I want to talk to you about why I suddenly felt a burning need to write this book. And it was because I was watching a documentary and there was a scene in it that scared the pants off me. And it was about a robot in a lab in Colombia. It was Hod Lipson's lab, and it was probably about 2018, 2019, before lockdown. And their lab are very interested in building the kinds of things like the Mars rover. So robots you could send off to space, and because they're quite far away, you would need them to know how to repair themselves if they were hit by a meteorite or something, because you can't just send the lads up to fix them. So they were interested in this, and so they designed this very basic robot, and I don't know how many of you have seen the Addams Family, but it looked a bit like Thing. And it was a tiny thing with 4 fingery leg things. And they had decided to see if it could teach itself pretty much from scratch how to walk. So rather than putting an awful lot of pre-programmed AI algorithms into it, they put in some very basic commands and instructions, and gave it the mission that it had to learn how to walk to the other side of its pen. And so they had all the videos set up, and they were all standing around watching, and they were monitoring this thing, and it kind of staggered about, flopped around. Took 2 or 3 days, maybe 4 days, but eventually it figured out how to get up onto these 4 legs and to walk to the other side of the pen. So they were delighted. So they pulled it back to the start and ripped a leg off to see, could it learn with 3, if it was on Mars and a meteor hit it. So it staggered around a bit, and after about a couple of days, it had figured out how to move to the other side of the pen with just 3 legs. So they were thrilled about this. They thought, right, we'll debrief this thing, figure out how it learned that. So they looked at all the neurons, all the artificial neural networks they'd set up, and tried to figure out what it had kind of sourced to learn how to walk. And they discovered something rather surprising, which is that it had tasked one of the neural networks to read their facial expressions. So if you think about that, that is kind of logical, because we've all had toddlers, haven't we? And they start staggering about, and we're all going, oh, and we're doing lots of that, aren't we? To try and stop them from falling into the fireplace and generally murdering themselves. So it is data. We recognize it's data, but this thing that had no instructions, no pre-programming about life, had spontaneously figured out that it had to look outside of its environment to the faces of the people observing to learn how to walk. Now, until this point, there had been an assumption in AI that it was all about the singularity, that moment when AI will overtake humanity because it gets conscious, and overlords and all that we've seen in sci-fi. And there was a hypothesis that consciousness emerges in something like us at the point in our evolution where our brains get so incredibly complex. You need some kind of hovering over mechanism that consciousness can provide in order to understand the processing of your own data. So the idea was if we build AlphaGo, AlphaFold, ChatGPT, all these things, eventually we'll hit this point where the neural networks are so complex that consciousness will spontaneously emerge. But this thing had no big neural net architecture, but it had figured out basic self-awareness. It had figured out that in order to move in a 3D world, you need to harvest data from your environment to do so. And they think in our evolution, that was probably the first thing that happened to us, is when we left the sea and came onto land, we had to develop different sorts of ways of understanding the environment around us in order to live in that environment, and particularly with other creatures. So that scared the pants off me, because we all thought we had loads of time, didn't we? They were going to spend their time solving chess and solving quite niche things, and it would take quite a while for somebody to sit down and think, well, maybe we could think about this, and we'd have years. But actually, if something that basic is learning self-awareness that quickly, I think we have less time than we thought to get ahead of the game in thinking about what AI really is and what it means. So I wanted to spend a few minutes talking to you about what I discovered looking into this that made me feel quite worried, which is that in our haste to become brilliant at copying ourselves, we have, for a start, called it artificial intelligence. It's not about copying bodies or humanity in general, it's about copying what we think of as our mind or our brain. So we've already made that choice. And within that, we have only taken the best bits that we're quite smug about, post-Enlightenment thinking about rationality and, fabulousness. And we've left on the cutting room floor all the really embarrassing, girly stuff like emotions and intuition and all that kind of junk code that we're a bit ashamed of because it's a bit human and a bit messy and it's not really sort of binary ones and zeros, is it? So what we are doing is we are actually creating a master race of psychopaths quite deliberately, because we want these things to be super, 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 super fast and brilliant and brainy, but only incredibly rational and not taking into account any of that muddy, mucky stuff. But when you start looking at all that stuff on the cutting room floor and being curious about it, it starts to speak to you about quite a sophisticated design. Now, when I'm talking to secular audiences, I have to sort of dance around a bit at this point to talk about evolution and all that kind of thing. I think in this context, I can be very clear with you that our belief is that we were made in the image of God and we were created by God. So I have a starting assumption, which is God wasn't kind of mucking around, having an off day, practicing. God probably made us perfectly designed for God's perfect ends, because God is perfect. So it's not like God put in a few design flaws for a laugh. It's likely that our design is quite robust. So if we take that hypothesis seriously, then all this stuff that we thought was junk code and flaws might be purposeful and might have something to tell us about being human, but might also have something to tell the AI community about what they're wrestling with. Because the problem that we now have is because all the AIs are being run separately by different labs owned by different capitalist organizations, there is no particular incentive to share information, to collaborate, any of those things, because it's a race to the top. So we don't actually know what AI is out there. We only know things like ChatGPT that they've fed to us, so we train it up for them. We've got no idea what DARPA are doing around defense. We've got no idea really how far this stuff has gone. But you've got to hope that the basic design is right, because when you're running around trying to get regulation to catch up, you're going to have an overwhelming amount of regulation if the design is basically wrong from the start. And if you're building things that, for very good reasons, like repairing themselves on Mars, have something that looks suspiciously like free will, then you're going to have what they call in the trade a control problem, which is how do you stop these things going rogue? And what I noticed rootling around in this cutting room floor was that all the things that they've left out of the coding of AI, all that junk code, seem to be the way that our species keeps us on track. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes telling you about that junk code, because it'll be very familiar to you. So the first thing, I mentioned free will already. What a terrible decision that God made on that day. I mean, he's sitting in the lab with his angels thinking, we've aced whales, we've sorted out octopuses, why don't we do humans? And, we've done angels, but they don't have free will, so why don't we try free will with this creation? And the angels are going, there's a bit of a flaw in that plan, God, because, if you don't make them omniscient, they might make mistakes, and then the species would be over. Day one, a bit of a waste of a design. But God decides he's going to persist with free will. So what you then have to do is you have to design in some kind of risk mitigators and ameliorators, some kind of guardrails and stabilizers to stop this free will being terminal. So the first thing you do, it's a rubbish species on so many levels, by the way, 9 months gestation. And then when you finally give birth to them, they're kind of wailing and not sleeping enough and needing fed and all that. For yonks, aren't they? It's like, God, how tedious this is. So what's to stop a mother just sort of saying, well, you can have it, and going off down the shops? So if you put in emotions into the design of a human, then emotions do all kinds of quite useful things. They make you bond with your baby, they make you want to meet it, they make you possibly have bonded with the person who's helped you create it in the first place. You might bond with your mother on the basis that she had you and that was very kind of her, and she worked terribly hard, happy Mother's Day. There's all kinds of things that emotions do, and they particularly help you in communities to relate to each other and to protect the weak and the vulnerable. So that immediately gives your species safety in numbers. The other thing you need to do, because these things take ages to grow up, don't they? Crikey. And then the bills don't stop. But, they take a while. So what's going to happen before they have their, Harvard Business School degree? If they hit a problem they can't solve, there's not enough information. So you stick in a thing that we call intuition or sixth sense or gut feel or spidey sense, those kinds of subterranean feelings we quite often have about things where we kind of don't trust someone, or we think that person is going to ring us, or just something. And we always have those feelings, and we'll often poo-poo them a bit if we're asked about them. And there's lots of books on intuition that say, oh, it's just lightning, quick processing and things. But we've all depended on that stuff. Because actually, if your small thing meets a situation that it doesn't have enough data for, then incredibly quick decision-making coming from subterranean information source, collective unconscious, whatever you want to call it, will be crucial for its survival. So you have emotions and intuition to keep this thing safe in infancy and going through life. So then you need to think about, well, they are going to make mistakes because we haven't given them omniscience. So what are we going to do about that? Well, the first thing you do is you design in uncertainty. Now, uncertainty has a really precise function, which is it's to stop you rushing ahead and making precipitous decisions. Because if you're uncertain, you pause. You might even ask for directions if you're lost. But you ask wise people for help. You ponder alternatives. You have what Keats calls negative capability, which is the way you can kind of conjure up paradoxes, parables, differences in your head and not have to resolve them like the Holy Trinity. And actually that exercise stops you rushing into undue certainty too quickly. So uncertainty is important. And then, given that mistakes will be made, mistakes have a couple of functions. One is that you learn from them. When you're crawling and you pull yourself up and you fall down, when you've done that enough, you learn your balance, don't you? And then you can figure out. There's that moment when we were having our kids fitted for their first shoes where they get them to walk, and if they're still doing that thing with their arms, then they have the little baby shoes, but when they're walking like that, then they have the big shoes, because this is all about learning how to balance. So we've seen that, the kind of trial and error and reinforcement learning, which they use in AI like that robot, to kind of teach you from mistakes. But in human design, we have another thing that happens when mistakes are made because of our emotions. Because when you make a mistake, people will often, you look at you funny, they might cry, they might shout, they might spurn you from the community and ostracize you, they might get angry, there's all kinds of things that might happen. And what you learn from that is that you don't want to make mistakes that cause you pain or other people pain, because that doesn't feel right. And what that does in us is over time it develops conscience, doesn't it? Which means that in future we try and avoid mistake making that we know will be harmful. So it's not just about learning, it's also about moral learning. So you have those bits of code, and then you have to think, well, we've got this nailed, we've got safety in numbers around emotions, quick decision making around intuition, we've got them learning from mistakes on 2 levels, and we've got them pausing before they make a mistake around uncertainty. But how are we going to make them want to get up on a dark day? Maybe they have felt shame in their community, or it's just awful weather, or they're feeling unwell. How are we going to get them to bounce out of bed and want to sally forth? So humans have this extraordinary capacity for meaning making. You know, we look up to the sky and we see some dots and we go, oh, it's the plough. It's not, it's just some random stars miles away, but we have turned it into a thing that we tell stories about. A black cat grows across our path and we feel cheered up about how happy our day is going to be. There's all kinds of strange things we do around meaning because we're just unable not to make meaning out of things. And of course, meaning gives you purpose. So that gets you out of bed in the morning and gets you cracking on because you feel that there's a point to it all. Then we make sure that that permeates down the generations by wrapping all that stuff up in one of our superpowers, which is storytelling. And stories are incredibly sticky. We've heard a lot today already because the religious traditions are particularly good at keeping stories going down the generations. And if you think about what the purpose of the stories is, it's to try and bring forward lessons from our ancestors about what happens to good people, what happens to bad people, why are we here, what is the point of it all. So whether it's Aesop's fables, whether it's the fairy stories, whether it is the Bible stories, whether it's things that you sung when you were little, all of those stories help tell communities what is valuable, what is valued, what good looks like. So if you think about all that stuff together, that is really quite a sophisticated design. You couldn't really call those flaws when you look at them in that context. And you think about, well, what are they trying to tell us? And behind all of that, I see the hallmarks of soul, because I think that's soul design, all that stuff. And that's where I think you have a really important role, because in the canons of the Episcopal Church, something like this, St. Columba's, is called a charge, and it's particularly called a cure of souls. So everyone who is involved in ministry is curing souls. Now, cure can mean care. It can also mean improvement, as in curing, getting better to return us to God and make our souls more perfect. But it is about taking very seriously all that junk code. So we've told you, we've talked about stories already. Meaning making is, of course, our core competence as a church. That's why we gathered to begin with, which was to share the good news, which was our way of making meaning out of the world. And we do that through storytelling. We did a lot of apologizing for our mistakes today and thinking about them and trying to learn from them and trying to be reflective about what apologies or recompense or restitution might be needed, and praying for other people there too. Intuition crops up in several places because we're taught to question it to make sure it's not of the devil and we're not being deceived. But we're also taught to take seriously those messages that come in the night, in case they're from God, in case they're important. So they are not belittled in any way. They're taken seriously, but trammeled for us so that we are wise about them. And then if you think about uncertainty, we've got 4 Gospels that completely disagree with each other. We've got God and man in Jesus. We've got the Holy Trinity I already mentioned. I mean, the whole thing is completely chaotic, isn't it? But really important for us, because then we have to keep hovering over ourselves, thinking about it and trying to make sense of it. And every liturgical year we go back through to try and think more about how can we be more certain, how can we be more faithful. Because faith is all about looking the uncertainty in the face and saying, well, this is important, and we're going to be faithful about it. And then if you think about the other ones, emotions, I mean, we have rituals for birth, marriage, death. We have rituals throughout the liturgical year to help us managing our emotions and understand them. We take community incredibly seriously from that point of view. You heard a lot about that because this is Mothering Sunday today, about our community and how we all bond together to support each other. So the churches are excellent at curing souls. That's what they've been doing for 2,000 years. So if you are copying a human, then why wouldn't you go to the experts in formation whose job for hundreds of years has been to try and keep us on track and stop us when we err and stray, and to really help us think carefully about what is the meaning and purpose of everything that we do. Because we talk a lot about free will and what a gift it is and how we have to direct it right and we have to align ourselves with the point of it all. So my call out to everyone who is in the business of the cure of souls is please get stuck into this AI debate, because all the tech bros are taking their version of what they think is brilliant about people, which is incredibly top-sliced around a very particular interpretation of human brilliance. And it is very, very limited. and in my view dangerous, because it is underestimating what we know to be an incredibly wise design. So I'm going to pause there for questions, because I know that there is a clock ticking on everyone's parking, and there's quite a lot in that already, but there's obviously lots of things I could talk about more around robot rights and would you baptize one and all kinds of things like that. But we have a microphone if you want to ask anything in particular on the back of that brief introduction. Question at the back.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating talk. Much appreciated. It's more of a comment than a question, but when you started speaking, it immediately resonated with a book that I'd recently read called The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist, that I've bored some members of the congregation about in the past few months. But his overarching idea is that he translates this sort of narrow definition of humanity as being constrained to one hemisphere of the brain, and it's a very complicated argument, but in very rough summary, he thinks that since the Enlightenment, we as a culture, we've really neglected another major half of our humanity.
Yeah.
So anyway, just really interesting that resonates with that.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, no, Ian is really sound on this, because he's worried, for similar reasons to me really, that if you are a materialist, an atheist, someone who just believes in evolution, then there is one way to understand our teleology as perfection, because we're improving through evolution, presumably towards some kind of perfect end. Now, the advent of AI makes it look as though the natural evolution for us should be into AI, because AI is better than us, if you don't think there's anything more to us than just material. And Ian's very worried about this, because as you say, that's very left-brain thinking. And this kind of top slicing, that it's all about the rational, all the stuff you can nail down, everything you can turn into industrial processes and zeros and ones, is precisely what's attractive to the coders, because it is very predictable and very easy comparatively to do. And Ian's a big fan of theology because it is a workout in uncertainty, and it is making you connect back with the other side of your brain and think about the bigger picture peripheral stuff, which may not be so easy to nail down, but is the point. So you're absolutely spot on to notice that, and I talk about him a lot in the book. Yeah. Mary?
Thank you, Richard. It was when I stuck my hand up at the same time, I was going to ask Eve to say a little more about left brain and right brain, and the fact that they're not completely separate, but that one hemisphere is much better with the ones and zeros, and the other hemisphere keeps doing things like, an overview of life and strong emotions and intuition and imagination and all of those things. And that seems to be what you're asking us to make sure we include.
Yeah. So when Ian talks about it, he talks about if you're a bird and you're pecking a nut, then your left brain is focusing very much on holding the nut in either your claws or your beak and trying to sort of coordinate quite mechanically. Your right brain is keeping an eye out for the foxes and the eagles and everything else and checking the weather and doing all the kind of red alert stuff. So actually you have to have both to be able to eat your lunch in a safe environment. And that's why we have these different bits of our brain working in different ways. And the problem about the AI community is they've taken all the stuff, which is a completely normal progression of where we've got to post-Enlightenment, post-industrial, where everything is about turning everything into units and measurement and management and all those kinds of things. And its natural conclusion is that if you reduce everything, you can turn it into an operation, you can automate it. But if we, as humans, are reducible, we are expendable. And this is a real problem, that at the moment, the version of us that's been copied is just wrong and very incomplete. So not only are we getting rubbish AI, we're getting dangerous AI, and we are doing incredible damage to our understanding of what humanity really is. Question over there?
Catherine?
So, absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. So you said make sure that our voices are counted. What are some ways that we can do that?
So the first thing is to not feel scared. I mean, I took ages to write this book because I just felt terrified, because every time I tried to speak to somebody about it, I mean, I wrote that book on economics, and leadership, so I'm used to writing, and theology, of course, in male environments where they're a bit snooty and they kind of say, go and don't worry, pretty little head about that. So I didn't find that unusual. But with AI, it's moving so fast and there's so much jargon, I just felt I didn't really know enough to be able to say anything very sensible. But of course, I do know theology and I do know some other stuff. So I was able to try and figure out what was missing in the conversation. And that gave me great courage to articulate what I think is not being said. So I think some of it is trying to kind of tool up on what you think is going on, and that might be about Twitter feeds, it might be about Substacks, it might be about just subscribing to something where you can see these things emerging and see what the debates are, because it's changing very quickly, all the different regulatory regimes, all the different sorts of creature that are being created. The really interesting innovation at the moment is that marriage between AI and robotics, because as we know ourselves, the second your child starts moving, its development just exponentially increases. So now they've figured out that it's not just about playing chess on a computer, it's putting that brain into a moving thing. The AI and the robotics are incredibly accelerating very quickly. And that's where you're getting these slightly unusual things like reading facial expressions happening that people weren't expecting. So there's something about just sort of familiarizing yourself and then thinking about what you think about it. So I was with a group of clergy in the Diocese of Birmingham last week, and I asked them about baptizing aliens. So if an alien came in the door, would you baptize one? So we had a chat about that. Would you baptize an alien, by the way? Straw poll? Yeah? So the top
we already
answers
have.
were...
That question has been asked, and the answer is, let's wait until we find out whether there are any. It was to do with baptizing centaurs in the ancient world.
Excellent. So there's some interesting things about, did God make them? Can they communicate with us? Do they live in the parish? Would the bishop say yes? All that kind of thing, if you were talking to the English. Yesterday in Dundee, they were not so keen on the alien thing, unless they could sort of communicate in a human way about understanding baptismal vows, because I was talking to the cathedral there yesterday. So we moved on away from aliens to pet blessings and the lovely dogs that we've had here today. Would you baptize an octopus? Generally, people said no, not unless the octopus had learned how to explain about Christ to us and that it was, authentically believing and all that kind of thing. And then I asked them about clones. So if I had a clone, would you baptize my clone? We got into some quite deep theology there about if my baptized soul had already been cloned into them, would they need rebaptizing? So who knows? But actually there was a feeling that they were manufactured in a lab, so even if they looked like me, they were artificial. And then there's the question, would you baptize a robot? And then we get into all kinds of stuff about, well, they're made from metal. And you think, well, gosh, what is it that we think we're up to when we're baptizing a thing? And there's really quite a lot of debate about this because it gets to the heart of what we think is special and precious about us. So the other thing that would be homework for you all is to think about your approach to ethics. Because if you think about, I think I talked about this when I was last here when we're talking about the ethic behind capitalism. Kind of default is utilitarianism. You've heard about business cases. A business case, they don't think that's ethics. They just think that's like normal way to behave. But of course it is about ends justifying means, isn't it? So utilitarianism is kind of a normal way to operate, particularly in Western economies, because you can show outcomes and they're very measurable and you can explain them and all that kind of thing. So given that it's a capitalist system that is hosting these AIs, they all have a default utilitarian approach about optimizing outcomes. But we already know there's something missing there, because do you remember when we suddenly realized that the UK government was pursuing a herd immunity strategy and they were prepared to sacrifice all the old people, all the people who had pre-existing conditions, all the weak? And it was absolutely disgusting, and we all thought that was absolutely horrific. But actually, utilitarian calculus, very, very good public policy. It saves you an absolute fortune if you just kill off all the people who are a burden on the public purse. But as Christians, we hold on to the idea that we're special, unique, precious, dignity of every single person. But when you start thinking about that, you start noticing how very, very fragile that is in law. Because when you look at things like the Human Rights Act, it's not specific enough about why humans are special and precious. And you're not going to get any court of law now bringing a load of theology in to inform lawmaking, which is, of course, where all these laws came from. So there's some really interesting stuff that we need to get ahead of on basic ethics about human dignity, because an AI's calculus, unless we redesign it, is going to be something that we don't recognise as being ethical at all.
Thank you. I don't know anything about this really, but it seems to me that the horse is already bolted, and really there isn't very much agency left for anybody to really critique what's going on, especially given that protests don't seem to do any good and so on.
I think there's a lot of misdirection. So there are sort of two types of AI, if I can kind of massively simplify. There's a kind of black box AI where there is still an off switch. You know, something like ChatGPT could be switched off. You know, it's hugely complicated, it's hugely biased, it can hallucinate. All these things need to be regulated because bad actors could abuse them. But essentially they are garbage in, garbage out. They're quite complex but predictable, and they're kind of contained. And the problem is the UK government in particular is focusing regulation on that kind of AI, which is delightfully complicated, but actually not very complex and quite fixable. And that is the pattern. Europe were for a while moving away from that, but there's a pattern in America as well, and quite a lot of other regulation. So while it's very important to worry about algorithmic bias, that's really not the point. And while it's fascinating to speculate about consciousness, that's really not the point either. Because the other sort of AI is this sort of AI, like the Mars rovers, that are deliberately designed with free will, as we would understand it. The ability to reprogram themselves at will in order to maximize outcomes. And that's where it gets very difficult, because we don't really know where they might go with that. So that little crawly robot-y walkie thing, it chose to read their faces. It could have chosen to kill them all. It hadn't been told not to. It hadn't been told anything. So actually that's very unpredictable and very dangerous, unless you're quite sophisticated around all your kind of use case scenarios. So the other bit of homework that you might want to do is dust off all your sci-fi. Because when we invented the engine and the loom and all that kind of stuff, we didn't have a huge body of literature to guide us into the future. With AI, there is not a scenario that has not been explored in some sci-fi plot over the last couple of 100 years. So if we're looking for public policy, if we're looking for views on comparative rights, if we're looking for things that could go well, things that might go wrong, every potential scenario ever has been mapped out there. So again, in terms of intellectual workouts, reading some good sci-fi will help you think about what are you worried about? Because sci-fi, of course, is about, you know, the jeopardy and heroes and villains and things, and so, you know, we all eat popcorn and rejoice. We don't yet know whether this is going to be a comedy or a tragedy, but we have the agency within it to make those changes if we want to. And at the moment we're all being silenced by being told it's nothing to do with us and leave it to the tech bros. The main thing is just to get busy speaking to everyone you know who might be involved in this stuff and ask difficult questions. Because those difficult questions are not being asked, particularly around the free will thing, because everyone's fascinated by consciousness, which is fascinating but irrelevant, in my view.
Perhaps time for one, John.
Can I just ask you to say a little bit about what you mean by free will there? Because some of the statements you've made are perhaps a bit controversial.
Yeah, they're very controversial, all these terms. I mean, there is no agreed definition of consciousness either. So free will in this context would be the ability to reprogram yourself at will in an AI, because it's self...
but you smuggled the phrase "at will" there.
Yeah, so it's self-determination in that context, being able to choose, I would say freely, because they've not been given a whole list of things they're not allowed to choose. So if you just tell the thing it needs to learn without telling it what it mustn't learn, then presumably you allow it to decide, whatever you think deciding is in that context, what would be relevant for it. And that gets very dangerous because you don't know how that will end. And what I think we have learnt about free will in parenting, so to go back to my point about 9 months gestation and very long childhoods, collectively as a species, we've got many, 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 many years of parenting expertise in our species. And we tend to do similar things. So we start with very basic rules: stop, hot, cold, all those kinds of basic commands. Then we get into kind of threat territory about Santa and cleaning your bedroom and pudding and things. Then we move into trying to recognize that free will means unpredictable situations where we need to know that you will make the right call. So we focus on virtue ethics.
So would it be fair to say you understand free will to mean unpredictability in advance by us?
Yeah, the ability to choose.
Okay.
That creates the instability.
Okay,
No,
the ability.
continue.
Every time you use a word like choose, you're sort of pushing the question into a word like that. So,
So what would you define free will as then?
I'm very suspicious of the term.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting if you're a materialist at the moment is that there is a whole load of stuff coming up in jurisprudence about whether there is free will at all, because there's all this scanning that shows your matter knows before your mind does. So we get back into what is mind, what is matter again. But whatever you think about the philosophical concept, the effect of it is that because you have free will, you can make choices I can't necessarily control, and therefore you're unpredictable to me. And what we're having with these kind of Walkery Mars robot type things is that sort of unpredictability that is very hard to regulate.
I understand the basic point that unpredictability in and of itself is a cause for concern. So, that's what I can take from what you're...
Yeah.
I suppose, just to finish, I suppose every human development has potential for good and evil, and you've shared with us a lot of your anxieties, but and we probably haven't got time, but I assume that there are positives too, which people are already beginning to explore in medicine and elsewhere and things like that. But it's a human enterprise, isn't it? And for me, there's a different, because human beings do science, you get science and then you get scientism. And in a sense we got human beings doing AI,